Welcome to the Listen to Your Footsteps podcast. I'm your host, Kojo Bafun, and this podcast is an extension of my book, also called Listen to Your Footsteps, which is a collection of essays, reflections, and poetry on things like fatherhood, identity and belonging, growing up, creativity, and the lessons learned. The purpose of this podcast is to gain insight and learn from the journeys that others have taken. I explore the worlds of art, culture, design, business, creativity, and life from the perspective of Africans who are contributing to the redefinition of the continent and who we are. So my guest today is Bianca Sibiya. She's founder and COO of the Fixer Coalition, or the Fixer Co. Mm-hmm. She was most recently head of Africa operations at TikTok, and has had a long career in PR, comms, and marketing across various sectors. Now, the reason why I wanted to read that, welcome, Bianca.
Thank you.
So the reason why I'd written that down, because I have a confession. So my context with you, my reference point, was Bianca Miles, presenter of Basic, and then later on, Bianca Sibiya, co-owner and founder of Punk and Ivy, which was in fashion. And then some years later, all of a sudden I'm in email correspondence with you about a campaign with Samsung where you were, PR, you were head of PR, no?
Yeah, I was doing the comms for the Note 10 launch in South Africa.
And so that context and that perception and that reference point, and I hate it when people do this to me, but I was doing it myself in terms of how I placed you, like the context within which I placed you in kind of society. And we have common friends, and it's all a particular area, right? Fashion, popular culture, entertainment, that sort of stuff. And then going in and looking, and it's like you went and you studied a degree. What's an industrial and organizational psychology. Explain those two sides of the coin.
Okay, I think let's start with the education piece, because we're from a generation where formal education post-high school is like a thing. You had to go to university, you had to get some sort of qualification that will guide you for the rest of your life. So yes, I studied at Wits. I did an undergrad in industrial psychology because I thought I was going to be somebody that could help, I guess, the blue-collar workers, to navigate what this new dispensation of South Africa was going to look like in the workforce. And alongside that, I also did anthropology and industrial psychology and psychology, so clinical psychology. And when I graduated, I was like, none of these actually interest me. Similarly with my international relations undergrad, I was like, I don't want to be a foreign policy analyst. Like, I have no business being on the international stage, trying to fight for South Africa within the political sphere. So when I went to Wits Business School, which was like post-grad now, what really sparked my interest in going into the comms and marketing space was part of my junior MBA at Wits Business School was you had to spend some time working in a company as an intern. And I got to work for a company called Grey Worldwide, which is essentially at the time, one of the largest ad agencies globally. And I got to work on these fast-moving consumer products, black hair care of conditioners and shampoos. And that really just kind of sparked my interest in basically saying, okay, you have an interest in the human condition, which is the psychology, right? You have an interest in being able to put together messaging and craft what that looks like, and how do you present that to become either a campaign or something that you make compelling for somebody to want to buy a product or a service. And that's kind of really how my journey started. So when you look at the trajectory of my entire career, I guess the single thread that runs through it is communications. The only difference is the platforms have evolved over the last 20 years, right? So back then it was, digital. Well, no, back then it was more print, and it was kind of traditional above the line media. And now we're in the space, which is where the TikTok comes in. It's like everything is led through closed wall ecosystems where content thrives and creates educational, entertainment purposes for the masses. And how you show up as a brand in those spaces is so interesting for me. Again, it's still psychology.
But you were, so that starting point, my first, when you kind of first came on my radar was as a presenter of this show that was very, and it was ahead of its time, like a lot of stuff that was created around the rage. Let's call it that ecosystem and that orbit, right? What's the timeline? So you because for a lot of people, especially at that time, getting into television, that was the stepping stone for kind of exploring that area further. And the people around us, because like I said, we have a lot of common people around us, all ended up kind of further on in those spaces. I mean, Azanya is now in Switzerland, but Azanya went on that trajectory. I don't know where Shane is. I used to talk to him at some stage. So how did that come about? And once it ended, what's the timeline in terms of okay, you're going to pursue this?
So 2001, again, I was at Wits Business School. And in that year of my tuition, I got a call about a show. And I was dating a guy at the time who was still studying at AFTA. And he obviously had seen the poster board for this new street culture show where they're looking for presenters. And that's how I got to then meet the team at Black Rage Productions. And that's how I got to meet Fiona. I interviewed with her. She gave me my chance to be able to do a bit of an audition and run some lines through her. And that's how I got the job. And ironically, that was also what helped me to pay for my tuition at the time at Wits Business School. And similarly, with all the additional work that I got through that particular job, like, doing voiceovers and whatever it may be, that also then gave me the confidence to kind of, buy my first car and get my first apartment and really start my adulthood, as it were. And what I really loved about that experience was it really taught me the importance of telling our stories as Africans from our own perception and feeding that into the world. And to your point, I guess the show was ahead of its time. Unfortunately, it didn't have a really long lifespan. I think, again, because the way it was formatted, there was a lot of kind of noise around the fact that we weren't necessarily prioritizing South African artists enough because we were moving into, artists that were from the rest of the continent. And similarly, you've got to balance international versus local because, that's just the structure of programming within the music space. And I guess kind of the evolution of that is it did absolutely spark my interest in going into media and really pulling my understanding of what I perceived as culture and how do we express that in, whichever formats of work I'm in, whether I was in broadcast TV at the likes of Viacom, MTV Africa, for example, because that's like a Pan-African platform that has now opened up a whole new world for me, going from a South African-based television show to now being in a media entity where I'm having to stretch my understanding. So this is 2002 now, where I moved into MTV after I'd finished off at SABC through Basic, and I'd graduated, and I got my first job in film, actually, before I joined MTV. Time really moves so strangely. So my first job was actually in film distribution, South African film distribution.
Was it indigenous?
That was at Ster-Kinekor, and then that evolved into indigenous film distribution. And that was such a profound time for me because, one, I didn't really have any formal traditional marketing experience. But again, I did understand the human psyche. And now you're working with these incredible film producers and film writers and up-and-coming script writers and sitting on these green light panels where you are reviewing scripts. And I got to work on Tsotsi back in the day. I got to release that. And it's such a profound experience looking back because, again, it's now working with these incredible creatives who've never left the country before. They're in this Oscar-nominated film. They've never been on a plane before. So there's like psychology stuff that they had to deal with. And then similarly, the film garnered so much love and attention globally. We now had to kind of, how do we ring fence all of that and bring that same energy back into South Africa and get people to understand that you've got to spend your hard-earned money and go and buy a ticket for this film and go and sit in the cinema and watch it. And I think it also leans back to just how we perceive success as South Africans and as Africans. I think if things make sense globally, and they acknowledge it, only then do we tend to buy. I think if you look at the likes of like Tyler, for example, I think she's really followed a similar blueprint in terms of how she's grown her success.
I mean, I do have lots of theories, but one of them is because of history, South Africa craves heroes. But in those heroes, it's also that external validation. I mean, Africans, we do it in general, but it's kind of if you're validated outside, so if you're validated by the Americans, it's only then that you then, there's a particular level that you reach. And I mean, you look through history and the sad part is also when they fall, it's very, very painful. So a Hansi Cronje, a Oscar Pistorius, it feels like it goes to the fabric of the country and society, because each person is put up on a pedestal to represent. It's like, okay, because they're succeeding, it means we have value. We have a collective value.
True.
And the minute there's a crack in it, and all of us are fallible, right? The minute there's a crack in it, it feels like it affects the entire country's national identity.
Absolutely. I mean, look at Siya. We all feel like we're going through that divorce and our parents are splitting up, and now we're like, whose side are we taking? Who do we believe?
Yeah, so fortunately for me, I've never had that. So I never understand. I understand it, let's say, on an intellectual on an intellectual level. Like, I get it because I've lived here. I've lived here for a long time, but it's like I have zero interest of zero. I am not vested in it whatsoever. But over the weekend, my wife and friends, this was a conversation. Like, this was a conversation around the table. And like, it doesn't pay my children's school fees. That's my standard line. Like,
absolutely.
As long as it doesn't affect my children's school fees, it's none of my business.
Yeah, but we need heroes, to your point. I think we've got to put certain people on a pedestal because it gives us a sense of grounding in terms of our collective consciousness as South Africans. And it's important that we do that because it also means that we're not living in our little bubbles. We are a collective consciousness as a country. Like, everything we do, for the most part, we fight it together, we celebrate it together. I mean, sports has been probably one of the shining beacons of us being able to just kind of lift ourselves up from all the bullshit that we have to experience on a day-to-day basis. And that really brings us together. I'm by no means a sports fan, but I see and I feel the energy when there's, a game going on, for example. And it's the same with music. And I think, to your point, yes, we don't necessarily need heroes because it does kind of feed into our ego and our vanity. But at the same time, it gives us a bit of a lift from the everyday mundaneness of life. And it gives us a sense of hope, And South Africa should be on every single person's lips globally, because where else are they going to? Africa's like the last of the best of the places in the world that is going to drive innovation, creativity, lead culture, and inspire the rest of the globe. I mean, think of how accelerated all these tech companies are. They're all grabbing Africa right now. Everybody wants a piece of the pie because where else are they going to go to? Yeah.
And it's also defining. We've finally reached the stage where our lens is becoming a prominent lens. Because before, the lens was always external looking in. And, now our lens is coming to the fore.
It's great. I think it's a lot to do with, I guess, the trauma of apartheid. And now we're finally starting to see ourselves and our worth and recognize what that looks like. And I think the younger generation are really going to drive that harder now more than ever before. I mean, just as an example, I was at the SAFTAs on Friday, and I bumped into this filmmaker. She can't be more than 23 years old. And I met her literally on the night, and she was telling me about how she filmed the new Tyler music video. And I said, so what keeps you inspired to want to stay in an industry where, by and large, not many people go and buy tickets to cinemas anymore? Like, why do you want to keep pushing hard in the film space? And she said, because it's my purpose and because it's the hill I'm willing to die on. And it threw me because I recognized that she is fundamentally focused on telling the African narrative, telling her experience of being South African and pushing that into her art. So she's really trying to drive, even with her minimal resources, as much as possible to push this industry forward. We've never had that before.
Yeah. I think from a South African perspective, what I am seeing is the young ones coming up see themselves from a global perspective as opposed to just a localized South African perspective. And if you look at other, people from other parts of the continent, like, because, they traveled or you have the world is is slightly different for those of us privileged. So, I mean, like my family went from Ghana to Germany to Uganda to Lesotho. And as a 10-year-old, I would be shipped to relatives in Germany, which had an influence on my perception of my place in the world. And with my kids, I was talking about maybe take a year off after high school and travel. Like my work is to figure out how to make that happen, but it's not like a step too far. When I talk about kind of going to study and do tertiary, and I'm like, look at the world, and look at potential places you want to go to, and then we'll make the decision about what is possible. Don't look here because the assumption is that, we can't get there. And I have nieces. I have a niece who's in Belgium, and I have a younger sister who's in the UK. So it's a lot more, I'm finding that for the younger South African kids, they understand that actually those places, those spaces are accessible. And therefore they can also build. So a filmmaker like that, like if in 6 months' time she's working on a project in Berlin or in Brussels or wherever, even though she's based here, they realize that they can do that now.
The world is a very different place.
Yeah. Whereas before, particularly from a South African context, it was literally, because it was so insular, especially during apartheid, everything was so insular. Nothing really existed mentally and spiritually and emotionally beyond the borders.
Exactly. Such a wild thing to think about, how quickly the world has opened up. Like it's taken us a minute to get to this place, and now we're here where everything is at your disposal.
So what is this? I noted that you'd said you're the first generation to graduate in your family.
Yes.
So where was, and you talk about kind of, we also come from generations where you're going to go to university, right? It wasn't a discussion, it wasn't an option. Where was the seed planted for what you specifically studied?
Purely by luck, to be honest with you. I think, again, going to university was my mandate for myself, because I believe that was my way of getting one step ahead of what my parents never had access to. Just because the nature of, the generation that they grew up in, both of them were boomers. They never had the opportunity to go to university. So once I'd graduated from Sacred Heart, as part of that final year of grade 12s, they go through the journey of saying, what are your aspirations? Let's do some psychometric testing. Universities come to the school, they pitch their packages and offerings based on whatever courses that they're offering. And I was like, okay, I don't have money to go to university, but I'm going to apply and let's see. Obviously, I didn't get any bursaries because I wasn't an academic by any means, but I passed decently. So when I got into Wits, I was like, okay, there we go. I'm going to Wits. How I was going to pay for it was another story. And I figured that out after I found TEFL, whatever it's called. It's our NEFSAS solution, where you can obviously access funds from there. The courses that I chose, I had no interest in doing engineering. Medicine was not my jam. And also I didn't have the maths to be able to get those courses. And for me, humanities made sense because I always laugh. When I was in primary school in Durban, they gave you a psychometric test in like grade 4 or 5. And my results came back saying that I should either be a vet because I care for animals, or I should be a lumberjack. Which is lumberjack. So jumping back to my decision of choosing humanities, that's okay. I want to be able to look at, the human brain, understand a bit more about psychology. And anthropology was the other thing that really interested me. So that became part of, like my first year courses. And that's kind of pivoted into focusing on psychology and then industrial design. But that's kind of how I started. And I think for me, again, just being able to graduate was a big thing for me because, my mom only finished her grade 7 or 8. I don't know if my dad actually got to finish high school, to be honest with you. Just a different generation. She got married when she was 16 to my dad. She was a hairdresser, and then she got discovered as a model at the age of like 25 or 6 or something, with 2 kids, mind you, my brother and I, on her hip. And then she left the country. She got to travel the world. They gave her a passport during apartheid under the strict guidance, she's got to bring her foreign currency back. So everything she earned, she had to bring back and deposit into a local account. So what I understood in terms of her experience, I wanted something different for myself that I could carve. And for me, it was, if I can hang my success and my future on the security of knowing that I can have some sort of accreditation that gives me a little bit more validation when I go and find that first job, then that's what it'll be. I'll do the undergrad and I'll go through Wits, and I actually enjoyed it.
Where's your family from?
Durban.
Okay.
Originally, yeah. So I didn't grow up with my parents because they divorced when I was 1. So I was raised by my grandparents in Wentworth, opposite that wonderful, beautiful oil refinery that gave everybody asthma in Wentworth. So they raised me from the age of about 7, and I left there at the age of 13 to come back to Johannesburg. And that's when I started living with my mom for like the first time. And my dad was already in Johannesburg, obviously with his other wife and family. And that's how I started my high school career. So I moved in with my mom, and that's how I ended up
at Sacred Heart.
And how I ended up at Sacred Heart was the architect who owned the building that I lived in Yeovil was very good friends with the nun and the priest who ran Sacred Heart. And he was an old English guy, and he was such a firm advocate of, what do they call it? The Marist Brothers educational system, because it's a global fraternity of schools. So when I moved in that December before I started in January, he told my mother, he was like, I'm going to get her into the school. Just leave it with me. So that's how I got into Sacred Heart.
And essentially, I mean, Sacred Heart, in terms of, it has a certain, I mean, I didn't go there and I have friends who went there, but it has a certain energy, and the people who went to school there are in very interesting places today. I mean, it's one of those schools that I think if you mapped, even if it's your generation or, a decade period, and you map where everybody is today, it would make for interesting reading and interesting insights into society today.
Somebody needs to do a case study.
Yeah.
I'd also love to see that, because I know for a large part, a lot of them are in film, law, commercial law, and film content law. Some are in radio. A lot of them are entrepreneurs.
Marketing.
Yeah. It's fascinating. So I guess my journey within Sacred Heart, I think from day one, when I got there in January 1993, I was suddenly faced with this, what the hell is this? There's white people around me. I have white teachers. People have money. These young people have traveled the world. They're daughters and nieces and nephews and sons of politicians. And what? Nelson Mandela's granddaughter? And Trevor Manuel's daughter? Like, it blew my mind. So now I'm having to really shift my understanding of what my little small world was in Durban, where it was just a predominantly Black and colored community, to now this big city of gold where everything is shining and bright and people have lived experiences at the age of 13. And there was mixed race couples, and it was just bizarre. It took a bit, a bit of a beat for me to really process what that is, but I threw myself into it within the first 6 months. And I think what really made it also a lot easier for me was, people were very warm and open and welcoming. And because there were such different experiences across people that were in my class specifically, because of the fact that a lot of them were expats living in Europe and in the US, and then coming into South Africa and trying to start their school and, really settle into being South African, coming home. And that was great for me. I got to really kind of enjoy surrounding myself with people that were very different to me, even though we were of the same generation. And my circle widened, and my experience of the world got so curious. I was suddenly going to town on a Saturday for them matinees in my little cut-off jeans shorts. And that's how I got to see Aaliyah for the first time at the age of 13 or 14, performing live at a club. It's bizarre. And I think really what I can take out of that is there was freedom to just be yourself, but also you were encouraged to be curious about the rest of the world. And I think for me, that's probably one of the things that I still take to this day is just got to look for shit, man. Just don't be bored about the life that you have, and don't settle in your complacency.
And there was a particular energy at that time as well.
Yeah.
I didn't come to Joburg a lot then. It was kind of just popping out here and there. But from kind of that 93, 94
quite though.
till I'd say 99, Yeah, by the end of the decade, I was in Joburg, staying in Berea. There was just an energy to, especially the city. I mean, I always say, I don't have a lot of allegiance to, let's say, the country. It's my home and it's where my family's from. But I'm a Joburg person. Like, I've been in the city for 20 years, and weirdly enough, it's one of my favorite cities. But especially that era, there was just an energy, and there was just stuff going on as everybody was kind of finding their lane, and to a certain extent being unapologetic about it.
100%. And I think it's largely got to do with the fact that there was no gatekeeping. You know, so, you know, when Kwaito took off, when hip hop became like really embedded into the everyday culture, you know, it became a norm. Like, you've got to go to Rosebank and sit in, look and listen with your earphones on in the store and pick out as many CDs as you can and listen to that new album from The Far Side or Tribe Called Quest or whatever it may be, because you want to be ahead of what people are enjoying globally, because you can't get that in a Vibe magazine. Like, you don't know what the sounds are like. So I think for me, again, it's about how information traveled and how culture quickly spread amongst, I guess, the consciousness of the kids that I was hanging around at the time. That for me was really pivotal to my understanding of the world and culture, and, you know, the role that music had to play in and defining your creativity and really just setting yourself up and kind of carving a positioning for yourself in that little space. And alongside that is also giving back. So one of the things that I really appreciated, especially growing up in Yeoville, is it was just an understanding that you kept the streets clean, you picked up dirt, you helped people on the road if they needed food. You never walked past somebody on the road who you know, looked like they were less destitute than you without saying anything or giving them food. And I remember even something like the bakeries that were off Rocky Street. I think it was called Shiloh's Bakery. It was a Jewish bakery at the time. I never forget, there was not a day that would go by when I was walking from Sacred Heart back home where they would not come to the door when they would see the kids walking past, and they'd come out with a tray of cookies and be like, who's hungry? While you're walking home, have some cookies, take an extra one in case you see somebody down the road. And similarly, during that time, I remember in the 1994 to 97, there was also a monetary ecosystem that was happening within Yeoville, because they were trying to develop a way for businesses to be able to exchange services through a non-monetary form. I don't know if that was something that ever crossed your path. And everybody would have a specific sticker.
It was later. You are listening to the Listen to Your Footsteps podcast, a podcast in which I chat to Africans from a cross-section of society and sectors, including art, culture, design, business, and creativity, to name a few. I delve into their journeys, the decisions they've taken to get to where they are, how they do what they do, and everything in between. Essentially, we go wherever the conversation takes us. It was much later in terms of, I took two groups. I was doing some work for one of the business schools, and I took two groups in immersions. And the one immersion we did was the Yeoville Traders Market. But we're talking what, maybe 8-9 years ago? And one of the groups was from the banking sector, and the whole conversation was around, you know, in South Africa, it's bank the unbanked. Like, this is the rallying cry for financial institutions. But it's people sitting in Sandton going, oh, we need to create products for these people. And there was a guy who, I think is like Italian, or like, I think Italian heritage. There was this random guy who ran the space. And they did, so if somebody was traveling and they were from all across the continent, you know, South Africa, etc. But if somebody was traveling to a place where there's a particular product, they would buy for other stalls. So you'd have vegetable stalls, you'd have 4 lined up, but they're not necessarily competing, like, because sometimes they have the same things. But if there's an opportunity, then they're buying together.
I love it.
And they were also negotiating, like, living conditions, like in apartments and stuff, whereas a collective, this guy was helping them to, you know, negotiate accommodation as a collective. But that was, I don't even know if it's still running, because then COVID came, and like, I literally haven't been there since then.
It's still a similar principle though. And I love it. I think we And whilst I understand the need for formal banking systems and having those things in place, I think for me what really stood out was the fact that people were trading based on what they perceived as the value for their services and their product offering. So you would have like a plumber who would come into a retail store and say, your front window's broken, let's do an exchange of services. And they wouldn't necessarily trade actual hard cash, but they would exchange, I think they used like a coupon system that had a coding on it. And then you could basically add to your credits of what you have. And that became kind of how you would bank your value on what you've exchanged as services, which I thought was so beautiful. I don't know what happened to it. I think obviously when I went to university, I kind of lost track with it. But the idea of a community level consciousness of being able to shift resources, that's still an economy of scale.
I think it continues to happen just in ways that we don't know. I mean, once or twice I've been in spaces where, people from a particular area, and you realize that they have a community and they put resource together. Somebody close to me, a child had passed away, and literally how the community came together to bury the child in Zim. But then also realizing how people from the same area there are connected here and they support each other on both sides.
So beautiful.
And then what I realized is there's a lot of that, we just don't see it, right? In terms of, connection between communities, connection between, experiences. And on a different level, I mean, like I know somebody from Lesotho who has quite a prominent restaurant. I'm not going to say his name, but he has a prominent restaurant here. And a lot of the guys that he grew up with, and a lot of them are age of my younger brothers, they all grew up together. And you'll find they all support those that are in Joburg, and they're all in good positions and done well for themselves, but they will support the business. And that's their home base. That's where, they'll have their meetings or they'll hang out when they're getting together. And it's those subtle things where all of a sudden, you have a small client base that's consistent. You can do well with everything else, but these people have your back regardless.
It's like a shared value economy. Yeah. So beautiful. I don't think that exists anywhere else in the world. I mean, if it does, I think we just feel it differently here.
Yeah, I mean, look, I believe that. I mean, the idea of Ubuntu, it's an African, let's say, way of life. So from a South African perspective, there's the word that encapsulates it all, and it was branded relatively well at some stage. But for me, it's what it means to be African and the importance of connection and the importance of community and the idea of the collective. Whereas if you look at, especially Europe, you look at the West, it's all very individual. It's all very individual based. And I find that even with family in Europe, like the relationship is different. There's less of a need to, be in contact. Like my sister's in the UK, there's WhatsApp groups. There's always a link. Whereas I find with European family, for example, it's not top of their list. It's like not on their radar.
It's interesting. I actually have a similar experience, and I spent about 3 weeks in Finland. Out of all places in the world to go.
I
in
saw
August.
That, but it looked really cool.
Yeah, I promised my son I'd take that because his best friend is from there. And in my time there, I kept feeling like this place is beautiful. It's got everything that you need in terms of natural resources, clean streets, highly organized society. They win the award every year for the most happiest people on the planet. They're the highest consumers of coffee and ice cream, 365. But it was missing a community feeling. And I could feel that just in every space that I occupied, even in Helsinki, where it was buzzing with people, it just felt like people lived in their own little bubble and they were happy with that. But I didn't feel like there's any connectedness even if it's the insanity, it could be somebody driving on the road with their music blowing out of their car speaker, for example. I never even got to experience that. And that's the thing that really draws me back to living in the continent and living in South Africa. We just have a different understanding of how we experience the world as a collective, even in the good and the bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I have adopted family.
Mm-hmm.
It's like friends who become family.
Mm.
And you have that regularly. And even like our interaction over the years, we've been in each other's orbit for 20 years. So there's a recognized connection, even if it's like not a close connection. And it's the people, like the people that you know. And I've had that with people where we've never hung out. But when you meet, there's a connection. You're part of the same
community,
extended community. And therefore, how we're going to interact, we're not interacting as strangers, even though we've never hung out, which I think is inherent to being, like I said, it's inherent to being African.
It's so beautiful. I love it. And I think to your point, we have been orbiting each other for the past 20 years. But again, I think, social media has obviously made the world a lot smaller place. Yeah. So we get to keep tabs on each other. And even if it's voyeuristic, but at the same time, at least we have a reference point of, okay, this person is still doing well. They're progressing in their lives. This is what they're doing. When you see each other next time, you'll have some sort of conversation starting point. So, and I think for me, that's also the beautiful thing about the vulnerability of putting stuff out on social media. Yes, I understand now it's about personal branding and blah, blah, blah. But for me, in my own little generational headspace as a zillennial or whatever they call it, not millennial, I'm like a year before millennial. I also like knowing that I have a bit of a diary out there that captures my experience of how I see the world and how I experience the world. And being able to also see that on your channels and everybody else's channels of people that I don't see on a day-to-day basis or even just talk to on WhatsApp, that connectedness still exists there. And that's the stuff that I love. There's still, people are still living and experiencing life and they're happy and they're doing what they need to do. And you can see that.
I'm proper Gen X, so I don't know how I feel about it. Especially as I get older. Like I embraced social media. And I embraced all the platforms because I am interested in how these things serve as vehicles to tell stories, and I always have been. Like what you're talking about, curiosity. Like I believe that's the first thing you need to be in this world, especially today. But as I kind of like now, I'm like I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it all. In the early days with Twitter, for example, before Elon Musk's X, I remember people used to say, and I was very active, like 2008, 2009, 2010. And I was extremely active. And people used to say, what is it like to put your whole life out to the world? And I'm like, that's 5% of my life. I'm very controlled about what I'm putting out.
Curated.
And now it's even less so. Like, I put out little snippets when I feel like it or I remember. So yeah, the whole thing about, because before it was like, oh, it's nice to see people doing things. And I'm like, the way I so rarely post, and I post very specific things, you could imagine that, okay, he's cool.
Well, I mean, let's put it into context. There are 8.12 billion people on the planet. 5.5 billion of those are online every day, and probably most of them on social media. So we're in that space now where I guess there is a requirement for you as a living being, obviously over a certain age, to be able to use that to the best of your ability, whether it's to drive your business goals, build your personal brands, whatever it may be. But I guess the reality is we're now in that space where do you really exist if you don't have a profile? I mean, think of dating, for example, right? I mean, I watch a lot of crap, like reality shows. And I always find it so interesting that one of the points of references for a woman when they try to go on a date with somebody for the first time, they do all their due diligence through social media checks. They check you, they check your accounts, they check the people you follow. They look at like a historical timeline to get a sense of, what has this person done before I make the choice to go out with them. And that's become like our yardstick for how we engage with new people.
I guess for me, it's because I, to a certain extent, have withdrawn from certain spaces. And I am in a very deliberate bubble, but I have the liberty of doing that. And it's tied to my personality and where I am in life and that sort of stuff. So a lot of the things that, and it's interesting kind of doing a podcast, because now it's finding that balance between, okay, I need to do X, Y, Z for the podcast. It's tied to me as a person. So I can't just have it only about the podcast. And also the ways in which I am comfortable communicating. Like I started blogging mid-2000s, early to mid-2000s. And I still have like a site and I still like my old blogs are there. And that's the way I prefer to kind of communicate stuff. But now there's TikTok and I mean, I struggled with, from Snapchat, I was fine up till then. And then I struggled from there because Snapchat for me was the first time you turned the camera around. And I mean, I have a friend of mine who's always giving me a hard time. It's like, are you going to smile in a selfie? I'm like, I can't smile at myself. Like, I feel like it's like I'm talking to myself. If I'm doing a video, I feel like I'm having a conversation with myself. And that just it still feels awkward. So that's my internal journey in terms of figuring it all out. And because I work in the content space, like you've worked in the content space, and I'll know how to do it for you. Like I could sit down and break it down for you and all the channels and the way, the features and how you must unpack your stories and all of that. So I understand how to use the thing. But the minute it's me, it gets very confusing.
There are wonderful tools that can help you do that. You just need to master your prompts, plug it in, and it can automate it for you. You can check it and be like, okay, let's test this out for the next month. But I do understand your kind of reservations around keeping some things for yourself. I think it's also very different when you're kind of putting the lens back on yourself and having to create content around yourself more than anything else. But again, I'm much like you. I much prefer amplifying others and other brands and other projects and people as opposed to myself. But I have to keep remembering that people buy into people first before they buy into a brand. So we need to see you. So we want to see what you're doing.
My pinned tweet is human being, being human.
Okay.
# not a brand.
Dope.
Because even the brand thing, like it was like you're your own brand, your personal brand. I'm like, I'm just a human being just trying to navigate this life and making decisions accordingly.
Yeah. It's funny that you said that because I was thinking about that this morning, just like in this evolution of this tech world that we're living in. I'm trying to understand blockchain just because I know at some point we're going to have to get to that space where you've got to kind of verify yourself as an actual human being in that ecosystem. And what does that practically mean in terms of how you then continue with the rest of your life and your storytelling and being able to make sure that nobody's replicating you and putting voiceovers using your old Instagram stuff where they've masked your voice and now making you, Lord knows what, preach to the converted about a whole bunch of stuff that's not even within your own principles. That's some scary shit, but it's also so beautiful. And I always wonder, like in the evolution of what life is going to be like in the next 5 to 10 years, content creation is going to be very different. Very, very different. And I think there's a lot of pressure on like kind of the older generations to be able to figure out how do they play in those spaces and what does it practically mean for what we understand as the normal versus what this new normal is going to be. And how do you then play as a business owner in that space or just as a personality, especially with kids now, we're parents. We have a very different hat that we wear on a day-to-day basis. And I was laughing because my TikTok account is just ADHD content. I started at the beginning of the year and my son follows me and my daughter actually. And they always laugh at me once they've seen a video. I'm like, why are you watching it, first of all? They're like, why are you always talking about ADHD? I'm like, because it's important. I'm proud of the fact that I've been late diagnosed, and I've known for the last 4 months now. Like, I'm a very different person compared to when you would have met me in January. And I recognize that all of these opportunities to find, again, communities that you can have like meaningful conversations around the human aspect of just the stuff we deal with every single day. That's the stuff that I love. And that for me is what I love about social media and connectedness. Like the amount of conversations I have in my DMs with young females who are just looking for guidance and help. And that's why I call the account The Fixer in my TikTok, because I'm trying to just also use what I know as an undergrad in psychology. I'm by no means diagnosing people, but I've done enough research within the ADHD kind of space. And just as a mother as well, I have like a nurturing kind of aspect to what I do and how I engage with the world. And I recognize that as much as we see social media as this like sphere of just like fake people and, a lot of AI generated content and that kind of stuff, there's still the humanity that sits underneath that. And I think it goes back to your Ubuntu point. Like, I use that to leverage and drive how I engage with the world. I've met the most incredible people in real life, by the way, off the back of my TikTok account. Come to my home even. Some of them have come to my house. We have conversations about their experience, and I share mine, and we trade ideas and, experiences. And that's the stuff that I love. I've now met people that I would have never met before because of the vulnerability of it. So there's pros and cons too, I guess. Sharing and oversharing. I guess it just depends on what your intent is.
Yeah. What prompted the kind of finally stepping out on your own?
The journey of entrepreneurship has always been something that was in the back of my mind. So you mentioned earlier on that I started a company called Punk and Ivy with my partner at the time, and that I did for just under 7 years. It was purely fashion-based, but there's a lot of partnerships and things that happened with other retailers to grow the brand and obviously generate income and then be put into spaces where I'm now aligned with like a brand like Edcon, for example. And when I left that and went back into media, I knew that at some point in my 40s, I would go back to it, but I needed to learn more.
Okay.
And I think working in a corporate environment, it does give you a lot of access to systems and tools and governance rules around how you organize your day-to-day and how do you drive business goals and how do you set yourself up for success and hire teams and all of those things. So my journey now with the Fixer Coalition really was something that I thought about overnight. It was like an immediate thought. I was like, I understand the gaps now in terms of content and digital content and how brands are showing up and the complexities of the relationships between how kind of these major brands are working with their ad agencies and their creative agency partners. And there's so many different variables. And for me, as somebody who's coming from an outsider, I'm able to spot very deliberate gaps in terms of how they're showing up on channels. So I proactively go to brands, and I give them an audit of how they're showing up on channel.
Okay.
And I can link that to where there's opportunity, where there is friction, and what does it practically mean in terms of how they then move forward with their strategies within their teams to be able to optimize how they show up on these platforms. Because the reality is most people search online for anything, right? TikTok as an example, if you understand that people are using that as a primary search browser now, especially for the younger generation, they're not going to Google. They're going into TikTok because they want to be able to get somebody who can speak about why should I buy a Laduma jersey? How much does it cost? What's your experience of it? Is the quality good? You won't go to Google and get that. You may go to YouTube or you may go to TikTok because the search functionality is there. And then now you're getting people from your own country, speaking your language, giving you hard truth content that'll help you make that decision to say, actually, I'm going to go and buy that skirt because it costs 2,500 rand, but it's worth it because this person said it's amazing and the experience is great. And you can chat to them and ask them questions and you'll get feedback, right? So it's that two-way connectedness that I think a lot of brands are missing, and also the immediacy of the information too, right? It's relevant, it's current. You can obviously use a discernment to make a decision as to whether this is trash or whether it's believable, and then you go and activate it and spend your money on it. So that for me, there's power in that. So how do you take that mentality of building community that is trustworthy of you and being able to say, what is the shift that we need to apply in our organizations, in these massive corporates?
And I think it helps that because you've been in that environment, you also have an understanding of a language for them.
Mm.
Because I also found, for me personally, like I've also always been on the outside and the edges, but sometimes I don't have a grasp on the exact language which will hook them. So, I can come in and go, I'm going to help you with your storytelling, but they do not see the connection between what they're trying to do in terms of from a marketing perspective, etc., to this idea of story. And a lot of my work has been kind of trying to translate that back into a language that they will then understand to be able to go, okay, we want you to help us do X, Y, Z.
I think what I've used to my benefit with a lot of these conversations is, one, again, going back to curiosity and also looking at what people are saying, because generally, for the most part, the average person on social media, if they're pissed at you, they'll tell you, and they won't be shy and they won't hold back. And that is basically information that can inform how you then collect all of that data and make a decision as to how to utilize it. And I mean, we've seen, what was it, a month ago, where that one woman on TikTok made a video about her experience of working at a restaurant, which has now changed the entire restaurant industry, how they're treating kind of foreigners who are working in the back end from the kitchen's point of view. And it just takes one person to be able to really put an honest experience of either working or engaging with a brand or business to be able to mobilize a mass amount of people across the country to then say, actually, I have the same exact experience. And you can't put money behind that.
Yeah.
That's like a lived experience that someone is honestly telling you. And that for me is the power that I think brands are missing. How do you optimize on that? And how do you be able to create your own experience in building those communities organically that will become your advocates, that can easily go out and tell others, I get great rewards from my bank. They send me a text every Friday. They tell me that I need to, use this bit of money to pay for my account fees, whatever it may be, right? But it's like that becomes your storytelling, as opposed to saying right now, we're in that space where brands are still telling people tons of information every single day. There's no two-way conversation.
And it's funny because it's been over a decade that we've been saying it is a conversation.
Speak with me, not at me.
Yeah. And still kind of brands struggle with that. But I think it's also tied to, which is what you're bringing to the table. It's tied to, it's one thing for me to understand. It's another thing for me to be able to do. And sometimes the step from recognizing to, okay, I'm going to start with this first thing. For a lot of organizations, it's a huge step.
But I think we must also remember that you can never discount the value of data collection. I mean, if you think about how we navigate our day-to-day between our devices, whether it's phones, it's laptops, desktop computers, whatever it may be, we're all leaving cookies everywhere, right? It's very easy to be able to look at all of those different signal points and understand, what do I know about this particular person? Are they really with me as a business person or as a customer rather? And if they're not, what is the one thing that I want to be able to hang my hat on to be able to attract them and come and buy my products or services? We're not utilizing that data efficiently enough.
Yeah.
And that's the most expensive and most valuable thing that any brand can get their hands on. It's data. Everybody's vying for it. I mean, think of how many times you get a call from some random insurance company saying, hey, I got your cell phone number from so-and-so bank or wherever it is, because they're making money off your IP. Your IP is your cookies, right? How do we apply that same lens?
We're not doing it in terms of from our, because for me, context is always an important thing, right? Because people talk about content is king, and I was like, content is maybe king, but context is everything.
Absolutely.
And because it's still going one way, our context is not, we're not taking advantage of our context within that discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there's a massive gap in terms of how, especially within South Africa, the quality data that these brands are collecting about customers across the ecosystem, they're still not using it. My bank still calls me at least once a month trying to sell me housing insurance. I'm like, my guy, I have my home loan with you and my housing insurance with you. Why are you trying to sell me something you already have?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And I've been with this bank for 6 years. Where's the relationship? Where's the community?
I mean, it's like the random phone call I get around phone contract.
There we go.
And I'm like, I got 3 contracts.
And then they try to sell you an Android when you're on an iOS. I'm like, you should know this. For the past 12 years, I've been with you.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to be done, as you can tell. So it's about having these conversations and being able to go in as the fixer and say, these are the things that I identified, and this is where I can help you, and this is how I can solution to mobilize your teams and get them to work and be on the same page. Because I also understand big organizations, it's inevitable that there'll be silos, right? It's just the nature of the complexities got bigger. The more you grow, the more you also segment yourselves. So there's a lot of work to be done. So I'm using this time while I have the interest and ambition to fight the fight.
And the energy.
And the energy as well, because I'm at that point now. I know enough of where there's kind of pain points and friction points. And also because until we get in the next 5 years to where AI becomes something completely different and we've automated pretty much everything, we have the opportunity for brands to start building proper trust and better relationships and knowing their customers better. And that's going to take a lot of groundwork to get to. Right? Yes, you've got your data, but it's probably sitting in some repository somewhere and no one's cleaning it up every day. You know, to give me a contextual ad that says, you know what, hey, Bianca, I saw you driving on William Nicol. You've passed a Wimpy. By the way, you've got 1 voucher in your app from your bank. Go and get yourself a coffee for free. Like, that's the kind of experience that I want to be able to have on a day-to-day basis. Otherwise, I'm just going to switch off my notifications because you're not giving me anything.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is great.
We could go on forever.
I know.
Actually, last question, just randomly. Your son's name is a Japanese name, right?
Kiyoshi.
Why?
So his great-grand-uncle's surname name is Mandla, which means strength in Zulu, right? And when I was trying to figure out what I would name him with his dad, I was like, it would be really good to kind of pay homage to at least a member of the family, because between my brother and I, we were named after randoms. I was named after Bianca Jagger. And I wanted to be able to at least connect this new male figure that's coming into the family who has also Zulu lineage and connect it to a person that is very well respected in the family, which was Malume Mandla, which is my then ex-husband's first kind of senior uncle. So when I stumbled upon the word Kiyoshi, which means strength, light, and purity, it just made sense to kind of connect the two. And then I called Malume Mandla and I was like, listen, I'm going to name him Kiyoshi, which basically is Mandla, but in Japanese. And he was so happy. So Kiyoshi is actually a very common name. It's as common as John and Dave in Japan, but here nobody really knows it.
Yeah.
The only person who has reference to that name is Akio. You know the DJ?
Yeah, no, Akio.
His dad is Kiyoshi. Well, was. I think he's late now. He passed recently, I think. So his dad was named Kiyoshi. So that's always been our connector.
Dope. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Listen to Your Footsteps podcast is produced by Zebra Culture. If you have ideas of what we can do better, people you'd like us to have a conversation with, or would just like to share a thought, you can email me on info@zebraculture.com. To check out past episodes, go to kojobuffer.com/podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share with a friend. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, Listen to Your Footsteps, check out kojobuffer.com/book. There are details on the various spaces it's available at. I'd also appreciate it if you could leave a review or comment wherever you listen to your podcasts. Finally, there's the Zebra Culture by Kojo Buffer newsletter, where on a weekly basis, I share a curated list of articles, playlists, videos, etc. that have caught my attention. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed listening to the conversation as much as I enjoyed having it.